Hi, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is over 100 years old. We are a justice-seeking, faith-based policy and organizing network, and our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive United Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. A few announcements concerning our call today. We encourage you to continue to be on mute during the webinar while the speaker is speaking, and this will also help with our connection. We are recording the webinar, and that will be shared in the coming days, and we encourage you to share the webinar with others. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat at any time. You don't have to wait till the Q&A portion as questions arise. Go ahead and type them in the chat. And we do have closed captioning. It's automatically generated, so just expect to see spelling errors and other grammar errors with these automatically generated closed captioning. Today, we're excited to welcome David Wildman. David serves as the main representative to the United Nations for the General Board of Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church. He is also the area liaison for the Middle East and Afghanistan. David's traveled to Afghanistan many times since 2004. He is co-author with Phyllis Bennis of the book, Ending the U.S. War in Afghanistan, a primer. And we welcome David Wildman.
Thanks, Bridget, and thanks all for joining us. I'll share a little bit of background of how I got involved with this, and then mostly try and focus on what's happening today. And I realize that some folks may know a lot about Afghanistan. There's a lot in the news, certainly these days, but there's a lot of misunderstandings too. And so I hope that we can have plenty of time for discussion and questions, concerns that folks have. And most importantly, I hope that we can move in the course of this hour to what is it that we as people of faith can do to really help our sisters and brothers in Afghanistan that are in such great need, both Afghans in Afghanistan and those that have fled the country for various reasons. So first, Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church has been involved in many countries around the world in mission. I think many of you are familiar with the work of Global Ministries. And in Afghanistan, we have worked there for over 50 years in the areas of healthcare, doing small projects of eye care, mental health, English as a second language, development projects. And it's been very exciting to be a part of that work and support that work. Obviously, it's been through all different kinds of regimes. It started in the 60s, but was there under the monarchy, under the sort of pro-communist, pro-Soviet time, the Russian invasion in the 80s, but then also the Mujahideen period, the Taliban period in the 90s. Then with the US invasion, the period under the Karzai government in Ashraf Ghani, and even up through to today. So it's a long-standing witness of being committed to serving the needs in partnership with Afghan peoples in various communities. So I want to put up a little map to just visually, let me see if I always have to work on this here a little bit. Just so folks are familiar, if you haven't seen a map recently, that you can see here's the capital, Kabul. Afghanistan very much looks like a hand that's kind of sideways with a little finger way up here. This is the Wakhan, which is very high in the mountains. This particular map doesn't show the geography. It's one of the most beautiful countries I've ever visited, with lots of mountains that are 10, 14, 18,000 feet, so it's quite high. Kabul is surrounded by mountains, but then there's also the western side with Iran, and many of the refugees that have fled. This past fall, there was probably 4,000 to 5,000 Afghans a day that were crossing over from the western part of Afghanistan into Iran. Pakistan is the southern and eastern border of Afghanistan, and there's a lot of interaction. The Pashtun peoples that speak Pashtun are on both sides of the border. This was a border created by the British. Surprise, surprise, in terms of the history of colonialism around the world. And it was a border that was designed to really divide the Pashtun people. So that's why you have Pashtun-speaking people in Pakistan, as well as Pashtun as one of the major languages in Afghanistan. And then in the north, you have the former Soviet republics, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. And then you see way over here, although this is very remote here, China actually borders Afghanistan as well. I've visited projects up in the north. You may have heard of Mazar-e Sharif. That's one of the other major airports. In the west, in Herat. Also up in the northeast here, which is very remote. And those of you who may remember, there was a medical team that in 2010 were killed, returning from providing some medical care in remote areas. It was up in Badakhshan. But the Central Highlands here is also very remote, even though it's right in the middle of the country. Ghor province, and much of the community in this area are Hazaras that are Shia. It's a minority religion and a minority ethnic group that have experienced great hardship over the years, especially from the Taliban. So there's major concerns about the Hazaras. So I just wanted folks to see this visual here. I'll stop sharing that now, but just keep that in mind. There's lots of different maps, so I'd invite you to just, when you're finished, to go take a look at some of the maps. The UN has maps that update things around humanitarian relief, of where health is being provided, where there are health clinics, also where there's drought, which is a major factor. So Global Ministries have been involved for over 50 years. I first got interested and aware about Afghanistan over 30 years ago, was in 1989, when I first started my first job with the United Methodist General Agencies. And if you may recall, 1989 was the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan after 10 years that they had been there. And that same period was the largest covert military operation in history of CIA funding of mujahideen groups like the Haqqani Network, Hekmatyar, a number of other groups that were largely in Pakistan and were fighting against the Soviets. So there was massive US involvement in the 80s, though it was all covert. And you may have seen things like Charlie Wilson's War and some other excellent books about that. I don't want to dwell on that a lot, but in 1989, I had just started as a seminar designer across from the UN. And the Fellowship of Reconciliation had done a lot of citizen diplomacy with many places, especially with the Soviet Union around nuclear weapons, to have US people and Soviet citizens at that point meet. And of course, ironically, we have some tensions with Russia today. But in that process, they invited some Soviet soldiers who were veterans of the 10-year Soviet occupation and war in Afghanistan to come to the United States to meet with US veterans. And the Afghan veterans were like, we're struggling, we've come back, we're blamed for the loss of this war in our country, we're demoralized, there's rampant drug abuse, self-harm among the vets. We're in crisis, we don't know how to deal with the trauma of the things we've experienced and participated in a war. We need help, and the Fellowship of Reconciliation, as one of the oldest pacifist nonviolent organizations in the United States, said, why don't you bring a delegation here to meet with US veterans from Vietnam that have similar struggles that they've had, and we can learn from one another. So I happened to meet these Soviet veterans and was able to hear their stories as young men in 1989. I had no idea that 15 years later, I would be the executive secretary relating to Afghanistan on behalf of Global Ministries, and then traveling there extensively myself. And so I think we may be at another point where US veterans today that have served in Afghanistan in a way that's not happened in hardly any other conflict of 5, 6, or more deployments for the same people, have desperate needs. And I will just say parenthetically, this is not the primary focus of my talk, but there are several veterans a day that take their lives through suicide that are documented, and even more from self-harm. The number of US soldiers and veterans that have died from self-harm after the war has now exceeded the number, way exceeded the number of US casualties in the war. And I think that that's a sobering assessment of the horrors of war. And I want to just put that out there. And so I think that all of us, whether we're from the United States or Afghans or folks from Russia, all of us need to come together to address the horrors of war that have affected so many people. And of course, Afghanistan has been affected by 20 years of the US military and international forces being there. But before that, the Taliban period, the Mujahideen fighting period, and the Soviet period, it's been 40 years. So you think about that, anyone who is under 50 has not really experienced anything except for war in the country of Afghanistan. So that's most of the population. And we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but in some ways, Afghanistan is a country like a number of other places where it's more permanent traumatic stress disorder. So that's just a little background. I want to share a couple of key things that I think are happening right now. First, I'll try and talk about the humanitarian situation in the country that's on the brink of collapse. And just a little bit about what's happening for the people there. Second, I want to talk about just the economic collapse also. So humanitarian, the economic collapse that's happening, some of the human rights questions around the new government under the Taliban. And then also, we need to be aware of the massive numbers of Afghans who have fled. There are over 80,000 that are now here in the United States that have arrived since August. And there's more awaiting to arrive. And that's a real need as well. And so that's a place where we can move towards, like, what can we do? So first, on the humanitarian crisis, I was last there in November of 2019, so a little over 2 years ago, and I visited some IDP camps, internally displaced persons that were on the outskirts of Mazar-i-Sharif in the north. They had fled from a nearby province from fighting in that province. And the international community had come in and was working with the communities there to build wells, to build homes, to provide income generating projects. UMCOR and Global Ministries, along with other partners, were working on this. And yet already, they've been there only maybe 18 months. The wells were running dry because Afghanistan is in the midst of the worst drought in over 20 years. So that with increasing displacement of people, you have more and more people concentrated in urban areas that are drying up the wells, and in other areas, the water's contaminated. So there's a huge, if there were no war at all, there would still be a tremendous need in terms of the drought. Many of the crops, the harvest is at only at 50% this past summer. So there's a tremendous shortage in terms of not only food, but also income for the vast majority of Afghans who are agricultural and work in small villages. Probably still 80% of the country's population live in remote villages up in the mountains, which are quite beautiful, but very remote. And many of them still do not have electricity except for through generators or solar panels that have been installed. So it really sometimes feels like you've stepped into another century of agriculture happening by hand, not with tractors, but some amazing hospitality of those same communities. So I would love to share stories about that. So please ask about that if that's something you're particularly interested in. But these folks were looking at, like, do we just dig the wells deeper? Do we go into the aquifers? And this is something that's a huge problem of drought. Then you have on top of that, that with the collapse of the government in August and the withdrawal of the US troops, overnight, the economy kind of collapsed. With banking sanctions, the US and other Western governments have frozen nearly $10 billion worth of Afghan government assets in banks here in New York and in Europe and other places. They've frozen the flow of finances. So most of Afghan government official staff, so all the teachers in government schools, all of the healthcare workers in clinics and hospitals have not been paid for months. They're still working in most cases, but they've not received a paycheck. So think about if you have not been paid since August, or in some cases even before that, because the prior government was incredibly corrupt, and oftentimes the money did not get to the staff those last few months before the change in government. So with this economic collapse, international groups are trying, along with the UN, to figure out how to get food aid, medical supplies, other kinds of support for communities out into those rural communities that are often closed off in the winter. So we're now in the midst of the winter, where many of the remote villages aren't accessible and won't be until spring. So we won't know the full extent of the crisis, but Afghanistan has 38 to 40 million people, of which 23 million are facing severe food shortages. And in many cases, it's not that there is no food, the food is there, but they have had no income for 6 months and have no ability to get the food, to purchase the food. And even middle-class Afghans who may have savings can't access their banking. And that gets to the second point of the economic collapse, that 75% or more of the income for the Afghan government came from foreign aid and foreign donors. So mostly the US and European governments contributed money to cover. So you created, the international community had created an economy that was not proportional to the income being generated locally. And so if you cut off all that aid was frozen kind of overnight in August, that creates a huge crisis of just people go to the bank. And imagine if you went to the bank today and were told, well, you can get out $20 a week. That's the maximum. And you can't write checks. You have to only use an ATM, go to the bank to get the money out. That would make it pretty hard for all of us to suddenly have to cope, even if we had resources in the bank. And so almost all, 95% or more of Afghans, of all political persuasions, of all ethnic groups, are facing tremendous economic hardships right now. And that won't change unless we can address the banking sanctions. And so there's been calls by folks to unfreeze those assets, to release those assets. But there's a big concern that if the assets are released to the Taliban government, that they would be misused. They would not be directed to the needs of all the people. But in effect, I want just to step back for a minute and say that this approach of sanctions, these sanctions were, UN sanctions are part of them, were imposed originally in 2011 during the surge under the President Obama by the UN Security Council. They are, and then they froze everything once everybody left. These same Western donor agencies and governments were providing funds to a government that with all accounts, was massively corrupt under Ashraf Ghani and Karzai before him. There were many ghost positions where someone would say, well, I have 100 police officers in my district, so I need to get paid the salaries for 100 people. But in fact, there were 5 police officers, and the warlord or official kept the rest of the money. And there's a whole unit in the US government called SIGAR, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. There's some wonderful but disturbing reports there that look at what kind of accountability have we had. Over the last 20 years, there were many instances where US military commanders at the local level had literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash to hand out with no receipts, kind of as needed. So there was a lot of mismanagement, and suddenly when the Taliban come in, it's like, well, we need to make sure that this money is used in the appropriate ways. We should always have ensured that it be used in appropriate ways. But there's a balance here of, do you use money for salaries and hold that hostage as a bargaining chip for a government operating and respecting human rights? And I'm going to leave that as a question to folks. But at least for us as United Methodists, we are clear that sanctions should never impact food and medicines. So any kind of sanctions that are used that would affect food and medicines, well, if medicines can be sent in, but there's no salary for the doctors, what's the impact of that sanction? And so I think there's an urgent need to address these sanctions, to lift them and release some of these funds. And there's a struggle of how to do that. Now, I want to just give a couple other instances of the Taliban government. And there's different ways of describing it. This morning, there was a 3-hour meeting of the Security Council of the UN. I was following some of that. And a number of the UN officials would describe the de facto governing authorities. So they did not want to recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government, so they would use terms like de facto. Others would use terms like the Taliban regime. And I think we need to say the Taliban seized government control through armed force. That's happened in other places as well. But whether one recognizes them officially or not, they are the governing authorities and they need to be dealt with. All humanitarian agencies that are working there need to be able to work with them. Now, one of the things I've learned from my many trips to Afghanistan and talking with folks who've lived there even longer and with Afghan communities and workers in the humanitarian sector is that no group is monolithic, and that includes the Taliban, that there's a wide range. So even this fall, there's been a diversity of experiences around girls' education. Many of the schools were closed. Some schools had already been closed and were just reopening in September from the summer break. Other schools closed down briefly, but then reopened. In most parts of the country, although now in the winter, a lot of the schools are closed for their break is kind of January, February, and then they reopen for Nowruz, after Nowruz, which is the Afghan New Year, which is celebrated on the spring equinox in March 21st. So after March, we will see the Taliban have stated that they are committed to opening all the schools again. For the most part, the girls' education has continued through 6th grade. But when you get to puberty and the sort of 12 to 18-year-olds, it's a mixed bag. In some provinces, more in the north of the country, secondary education for girls has continued also. Sometimes now again, almost all the teachers are not being paid. So we have to, unless they're being run by a private aid organization. But the reality is that none of the teachers, even for the boys, are being paid. None of the health clinics are receiving salaries hardly at all, or maybe 1 month of salary. So in this case, how do you, if you want to ensure girls' education, a very important priority, and not one that the Taliban have acted on well, though they've changed some of their rhetoric and said they are wanting to reopen with appropriate education, you know, and again, it defines what they mean by appropriate. It depends from areas, but if you have no salaries for the teachers, the schools can't continue, any schools. And so I think this is why the banking sanctions is a key thing, and I hope we can have some discussion about that in our back and forth. Quickly, I want to touch on a couple other things. So how does one relate to the Taliban? There is a UN sanctions list of leaders in the Taliban and other armed opposition groups at the time. Now some are in the government. There's at least 30 or so different ministry positions. About half of them are on this list. So there's quite a few members of the new Taliban government that are on the UN sanctions list for a travel ban, for a freezing of their assets, etc. Now, if you want to negotiate, one of the things the UN did in the end of December and reaffirmed today was to exempt from the travel ban sanctions these individuals on the list that are there for acts of terror or alleged acts of terror, for traveling for the purposes of negotiations and peace talks. And so I think that that's an affirmation of the importance of people need to talk. And I want us to think, just step back for a moment. There's a lot of images you may have seen in the news about the US withdrawal in August, the tremendous press of people at the airport who are struggling to get out of the country. The US was able to, and allied international forces, with cooperation with the Taliban forces in Kabul, to evacuate over several 100,000 people in the space of roughly 2 weeks. It was one of the biggest humanitarian airlifts around, but that still is less than half of 1% of the population of Afghanistan. And that's why I started with the humanitarian urgency for all Afghans, not to diminish the urgency of those who are fearing persecution, who are out of a job, which falls especially hard on Afghan women. There's a lot of concerns about Afghan judges who had sentenced men, and they were in prison, and now they're released from prison, and reprisals. And there are reports by various groups of reprisals happening against former government officials, former military, and especially women. Women journalists also are having a particularly hard time. So any women in leadership, most of whom were almost all in the cities. And so that is a huge problem as well. And I want us to think about, like, how do you lift up both human rights and protecting at the same time as needing to lift sanctions and address how to get funds to the people that are working in these various ministries, many of whom were women. Many of the women have been told not to report back to work, but in fact, many of the men are not getting salaries either. So there's really a big, big problem. I want to touch on a couple other areas and then hear from you all. And so what is the Biden administration doing about all of this? I think they've done a difficult job that was long overdue of withdrawing US troops from Afghanistan. And that was completed. And it was not perfect. It was messy, but it needed to happen. And in fact, during that time at the airport, the US government and the Taliban were talking multiple times every day. For those of us committed to peacemaking and committed to the well-being of people, we should always celebrate when powerful enemies choose to talk with one another. And for those 2 weeks at the airport, armed Taliban fighters and armed US soldiers were cooperating with each other to evacuate civilians. That wasn't necessarily the story that was told by the news or by the commentators, think tanks, the so-called experts on much of US media. And in fact, many of them are the experts who kept advocating for more and more military engagement and actions in Afghanistan that failed so miserably over the last 20 years. So we need to ask, why are people so critical now of something without acknowledging their mistakes? And this is where, in a faith tradition, I think confession is a very important moment. And it's very important for the US government to acknowledge the wrongs that it committed if it wants to hold to account the Taliban and other entities around human rights abuses that have also happened and continue to happen. But we need to have an investigation. Congress is looking into this with the administration to review what's happened in terms of night raids in the past, the drone strikes. The New York Times and other independent journalists have done a good job of exposing that drone strike that was so tragic that killed 10 civilians, of whom about 6 were children, in August, when they allegedly thought they were blocking a terrorist threat with a drone strike. And this gets to drones as a big issue, and the over the horizon capacity that Biden talked about is very dangerous because it cuts off diplomacy. It does not protect civilians adequately. And it says some lives are more important than others. And I think that's an important thing for those of us in the United States to recognize that so much of US foreign policy has been designed to say certain lives are more important than other lives, rather than we have a humanitarian mandate. The second great commandment is to help those who are in need, to love your neighbor, and your neighbor is the one most in need. And right now it's our Afghan sisters and brothers. Briefly about the resettlement, there's a lot of efforts in communities around the country, as well as some communities in Europe, to resettle Afghan families. Many of these families were former interpreters, contractors with the US government, the US military, and there's tremendous need. So if folks aren't aware, or maybe you can share if you have experiences in your communities about resettling Afghan families. Oftentimes, if it was one person that was an interpreter, it might be that they are bringing their whole family. So the children, the spouse, perhaps a mother and father-in-law. So it's oftentimes many folks are arriving who don't know any English, even if the person employed was an interpreter and is fluent in English. So there's also tremendous needs for learning English, getting settled in schools. Church World Service is Catholic Relief Services. There's 9 official agencies recognized by the US State Department to help in the process of resettlement of refugees and folks coming on humanitarian parole and there's various visa forms. But there's tremendous needs there just for the folks who've already arrived, as well as folks stuck on military bases in the Arab Emirates, United Arab Emirates, and in Kosovo, in Albania, a number of different places that are still awaiting clearance for medical clearance, as well as checking their visa forms. And we're hoping that that can get speeded up. Lastly, I want to say that I think the UN has issued an appeal of $4.5 billion for humanitarian work to support the World Food Program, UNICEF, others. The UN agencies are all still working there. And many NGOs, non-governmental organizations, also are still working in Afghanistan, though maybe have adjusted what they can do. And the Taliban government have gone around to most of the health centers and said, please stay open. And so that's, to me, we need to lift up those examples of where folks are cooperating and working together at the same time that we stress for accountability around human rights for all parties. So I know that was a huge amount, but let me just close with an Afghan proverb and then open it up for questions. One of my favorite Afghan proverbs is, you can't carry 2 watermelons with one hand. And I think if we think about the urgency today and the enormity of the crisis that's facing Afghans, they need to be taking the lead in their own communities, but they need help. They can't with one hand address the needs, and we can't either, but together we can begin to make a difference. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. And Bridget, help me if I've missed, folks may have been putting some questions in. If people want to write them in the chat, or if you have a quick question you want to pose, we're a small group, so I think it'd be fine to.
We do have a question here. What kind of support, if any, is there in Congress for lifting or mitigation of sanctions? Is there a role for the churches of the Church for Advocacy?
Yes, I think there is some support. There's a number of folks in Congress that are, very concerned. And, it's hard to say what can get done in Congress. And I think here, it's really important to acknowledge that some of the strongest advocates for helping getting Afghans out of the country have been US veterans, because they served over there. They worked side by side with Afghans and realized, in some cases, this person saved my life. I have to do all I can to help folks leave the country and then resettle. So there's been tremendous work. The US has allocated funds. Just 2 weeks ago, it announced $308 million of humanitarian aid. But I think there has to be some push. It's the administration that has to make decisions, but Congress can contribute to this, of pushing to lift some of the sanctions, releasing some of the funds. There's $9.5 billion of Afghan government assets that are being held in US banks. The US also, Congress can push the US to approve releasing of World Bank funds to make them available for relief and development programs. Hearings is one way of doing that. And I think that what I mentioned earlier about accountability, I know the Pentagon is looking at evaluating its own things, but any organization that is tasked to investigate its own failings and shortcomings, that's one important role, but that is not sufficient. And so I think this is where Congress can hold hearings to say, not just what happened with the withdrawal, but what happened in terms of the way the war was conducted over the years. And how can we make a humanitarian priority first and foremost? Let's see, I see John asked about an Afghan family that resettled, and the US veterans were active in that. Yes, US veterans have been very active across the country. And some of the most active groups, at a certain point in August, there were a number of Afghan veteran groups that came together that were having daily conference calls to check in. Many of them had still contacts. We're talking with through WhatsApp and other, secure communications forms with Afghan colleagues in Afghanistan about how to get out. That's continued, though it's less. There are still many Afghans that want to leave, but the number that can leave is a minimal number. And now I think the big focus, there's two sides to this. One is that veterans groups are very good at working with churches and other community groups about resettling families, helping with the kids getting in school, helping find jobs. That's where Church World Service has worked with veterans groups. But the other side of it is to also encourage and urge diplomatic efforts for ongoing safe passage. While there's an urgent need for food and medical supplies for all the Afghan people, one always needs to keep open channels for those who are fearing reprisals. That should never be cut off. But most of the folks fleeing are going to the neighboring countries of Pakistan and Iran. They're not coming to the United States. And so how does the US support the neighboring countries to offer hospitality as well when they're very burdened already by several million Afghan refugees that have been there for a while? But I think it's a good model for veterans groups and church groups that are committed to peace, to working together. And sometimes we often haven't felt that way, but there's a lot of lessons we can all learn of working together. Now, somebody's asking about Martin Luther King's, isn't Martin Luther King Jr.'s contention in Breaking the Silence that there can be no meaningful social uplift as long as the lion's share of mental power, labor power, and money are siphoned off by the demonic suction tube of our war of terror for daily commerce correct. We withdrew combat troops, yet the CIA and others remain, especially through the greater Middle East. Thanks, Matthew, for that question. Absolutely, the military-industrial complex finds ways to profit from war and even from withdrawing from war, and then is quick to look for new avenues for profit. That doesn't mean we should leave it, they're quite powerful. And I often say to folks, if all of us contributed the most that we possibly could, we wouldn't come close to matching 1 minute of US military spending. And that's the military spending of we had a, sort of support war better package that was passed by Congress that's over $750 billion for making war. So huge amount of resources by bipartisan support, Democrats as well as Republicans. So that's the war machine is a big problem. And I think King rightly, and the Breaking the Silence was his speech at Riverside Church here in New York City in April 1967, exactly 1 year to the day before he was assassinated, where he first publicly challenged the Vietnam War. And that's where I think we have to challenge the war machine, even as we recognize that folks in the war machine, that individual soldiers, veterans, are often the best equipped to look at the ugliness and horrors of war. So yeah, the resources are scarce. $308 million towards humanitarian aid is the equivalent of what the US spent for 308 US soldiers being in Afghanistan. The cost was about $1 million a year per soldier. So at one point when we had over 100,000 US troops there, the amount of money that we were devoting to war, but could hardly train any midwives, could hardly support any efforts in healthcare, is truly tragic. And I think that beating the swords into plowshares is an ongoing struggle for all of us. But I think there's a capacity now to do that and to recognize we really need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that addresses some of the wrongs. And we should challenge the US media, mainstream media, that are bringing on numerous retired generals as experts on a war where they cost so many lives. and wasted over $1 trillion and have very little good to show for that. Let's see, someone asked about ethnic tensions are being exacerbated in Afghanistan now, as often happens in conflict zones. Are Hazars, Pashtuns, Tajiks, and Uzbeks being pushed into different regions and communities? Or is it not occurring? Yeah, there's definitely ethnic tensions are being exacerbated. You may have seen some attacks recently. There was a hospital that was attacked. Oftentimes those attacks are in Hazara neighborhoods, or if a mosque is attacked, it's been a Shia mosque, not a Sunni mosque. So without question, the Hazaras as an ethnic minority who are predominantly Shia and therefore often see more sympathy to Iran, have gotten short shrift. And I think that much of Afghanistan is people live in very small villages. So I want to say that some of it is the folks in one mountain valley may not really interact much at all with those in the valley only a few miles away. Because of the distances, they don't go over the mountains to see each other. They would have to go around. And Afghans have been, my experience of reflecting on this is they've been very suspicious of a centralized government. And they've been most concerned about their immediate neighbors. So Afghans that are farming are worried about the Afghans that live in the village further up in the mountains. Are they going to divert the water or not, so that we get enough water for our crops? And they're concerned about the village further down the valley of like, will we be able to get our goods to market safely? Now, in conflicts, without question, it's easy to blame other ethnic groups. The Taliban come out of the Pashtun communities, but are not entirely Pashtun. So there are Uzbeks, Tajiks, others that are part of the Taliban group. There are also warlords in each group. So one of the problems is the unaccountability of corrupt officials that were in the previous government, as well as now what will happen with the ones in the current government. And so I think when we talk about concerns, we should talk about the fears and persecution of all minority groups in the country, religious minorities and ethnic minorities. There are small groups of maybe 100,000 or so that have their own language, and they're also experiencing persecution, but they're so off the radar that very few people know stories about them. How would you rate the United Methodist Church and wider churches in their efforts to support Afghans? Have you been disappointed? Pleased? I think we're trying our best at the moment to be supportive of getting resources to groups on the ground. But there's a real, just how to transfer funds to different projects to support mental health, eye care, et cetera, in the country. Even emergency relief. I mean, in so many parts of the world now, cash relief has become the easiest way to enable needy families to purchase the foods and necessities locally. But we can't, it's hard to get cash into the country. So that effort is not enough, but there's been a lot of generous support through the advance. There's an advance project for Afghanistan where people can support through the advance of Global Ministries and 100% of those funds go to the work in Afghanistan. On the resettlement, I think this is only anecdotal. I don't know how many United Methodists are involved in helping with Afghan families resettle, but there's certainly a lot more needs. A number of years ago, Global Ministries kind of turned over to Church World Service the responsibility for resettlement work, so that they are the ones that we work with. Global Ministries has set up a fund of up to $1,000 of support for churches that are helping with the resettlement of Afghan families. And so if folks are interested, I don't have it here right now, but Church World Service, there's a number, I forget the other 8 organizations, do work in different places. I know there's folks in Colorado that have done this. United Methodist News Service has tried to cover a number of different local congregations that are helping with resettle Afghan families, but certainly a lot more can be done. Let's see, I'm looking, we have another question here. Shouldn't we as US citizens then confess to continuing the war of terror with our tax payments? Merely voting, thus condoning the war on terror and saying thank you to the troops instead of sorry for the betrayal and echoing in no uncertain terms King's call. Okay. Can everybody see? I'm reading these from the chat, but can everybody see these? Yeah, I think you raise an important point about taxes. Just basically, if you look at your income taxes, about close to 55% of your income taxes now go to military spending. So you can figure out your personal contribution to military spending. And absolutely, I think those who in conscience oppose war and feel that one way to do that is through non-payment of taxes. That is something that there are a number of groups, the War Tax Fund group, that have been doing this for years in various ways, but that's very important. And it's not just like, let's get Afghanistan right. You know, there are in fact US military bases in over 100 countries around the world. And the spread of the US military industrial complex is huge. I was struck, I'll just say a comment that like they redesignated 8 US military bases temporarily as quote unquote safe havens for Afghan refugees because that were arriving in the country in August, September. And I was like, maybe this is a model of conversion that we should permanently repurpose military bases to be safe havens that can be shelters for people needing temporary, not permanent solutions, but temporary safe havens. And that to me would be a wonderful image. So I think sometimes we are afraid to speak truth to power and try the things that seem like they won't work, but they'll only work if we give them a try by trying them and joining with others. I think it's not only an act of individual conscience, but also mobilizing with colleagues. Okay, let's see. Someone said, I'm aware of the grant from Global Ministries, but does it have to be with Church World Service? No, it can be with anyone. I just know the work of Church World Service better. And so region by region, Sharon, I would say if in New England, if it's easier to work with the International Institute, that would be great. There's lots of need to resettle folks. And there's a number of organizations that are doing good work with that. I have a friend who's been, a number of friends who served in Afghanistan with humanitarian organizations that are in the United States who have learned, have some Dari or Pashto, and many of them have been volunteering at these various resettlement sites to help with tutoring, language, just conversation, to listen, because most of the folks, the 80,000 folks who have arrived, come from large families. They still have family members back in Afghanistan. So it's not just like, let's help here, but by connecting with one family here, you will hear the stories from that family of their neighbors, their relatives that are still back in Afghanistan. And it will help direct you of how to kind of connect with families. I think an important thing to lift up is both the urgency of folks fearing persecution and the urgency of those fearing, where's the next meal for my children? And that both of those are happening at the same time. Generally, we go for about an hour and then open it up for more informal conversation that's kind of a chance to chat. So it's less presentation and more just interactions. But someone did ask about some of the organizations that are doing good work there. There's a number that have been working in Afghanistan for many years. There's the Save the Children have been working there, certainly through the UN right now, the World Food Program and UNICEF, but also Médecins Sans Frontières has worked there in the past. I don't have a list right now, so I apologize for that. But there's also a number of Afghan organizations. I mean, now it's harder for like some of the Afghan women's organizations to get support and to be open. But there is a need on human rights as well. Someone asked about a story. Yeah, Afghan hospitality is, and I think here, if you think about that, Afghanistan seems like this remote rural place where there's lots of folks up in the mountains, but it's also the historic Silk Road that for centuries has been a way station of folks coming and going with trade from east to west, west to east. And so there's tremendous desire. Afghans love having conversations over tea and chatting. Any store you would go into or shop, people would say, like, first stop, have tea before you decide what you want to get. And I'll give one example. My first visit in 2004, a dear friend who'd lived there for many years was helping me get around to visit and get to some meetings. And we had to go to a meeting on the other side of Kabul. And he said, well, what if we go by bicycle instead of car? So we were riding our bicycles. And then he said, we may need to carry them a bit because we went up over a ridge and it was like all rubble, rocks and stuff. When we got to the top of that ridge to then go down on the other side, that was where the most recent returnees that had been refugees that had come back were building their homes. There was no running water, no sanitation. I saw women carrying big jugs. All the water that they used had to be carried up the hill. I was struggling at 6,500 feet to carry my bicycle. And I was like, this is I'm gonna trip and like break my neck carrying a bicycle, not being in a war zone. But when we got to that point, there was a young Afghan boy and who came out and offered us bread and said, would we stop and have tea? And this was a recent refugee family that had just returned. And we were total strangers. I mean, we were kind of curious strangers having bicycles, so I think there was some intrigue there. But we could not leave until we had taken a loaf of bread that their family had just baked with us on our way to our meeting. And there are many, many places where folks, if you take the wrong turn in a mountain pass or in the desert, your life depends on the hospitality of strangers. And so this ethic is very important in Afghan culture of if someone is a guest, it is worse for something to happen to a guest than to someone a member of your own family. And so this hospitality of guests, folks may remember some of the biblical stories about the importance of protecting guests that have come to your household. And I think for those of you, from a faith background, there's a lot we can relearn of our own faith tradition from reading biblical stories by learning from Afghans and the way they practice hospitality with one another. That's still happening. Afghans are still finding ways to share with one another. One other quick story is there's a number of NGOs that have reported that right after August, the Taliban or local Taliban came in and to offices, into clinics, in some cases seized equipment. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, within a week, they returned those vehicles. They returned the equipment and said, oh, okay, no, you need this because this is for the well-being of the community. And so I think that one of the lessons I've learned, not only about hospitality, but in terms of security, that one's security is built on trusting relationships with others. And if foreigners are there working hand in hand with Afghans to serve the needs of the people, that is known and respected. And that's the greatest security. It's not perfect, but that is far better than any amount of bulletproof vests or armored vehicles or weapons. And so we need to just celebrate that trusted relationships, building those when they've been broken so severely, takes time. But we can do that with our enemies as well. And so I would hope that actually the US government, the Western governments, the Taliban government, all continue to talk with each other. There were just 3 days of meetings in Oslo that were productive, where Norway invited representatives from the Taliban government to Oslo, not only to meet with the Norwegian government, but to meet with Afghan civil society representatives, including Afghan women, to say, you know, if we're going to address the urgent needs, we need everybody at the table, not just men at the table, or not just leaders at the table, but everyone at the table. And so it's not, again, not perfect, but there's places where these things are happening. And I'm pleased that we're able to be a small part of that as well. I'll end with, I should end with one more Afghan proverb. And that's the other side of hospitality is one slap can hurt 20 faces. And it's a sense that when you insult one person, you've insulted a whole family, a whole community. And in the same way, if one honors one person, that one honors a whole community. So I know that I'll stop there, but maybe Bridget, you can kind of wrap up. But thank you all for joining. And if folks want to stay on for informal discussions, I'm happy to do that and would love to hear from more of you of things you're working on. But Bridget, thanks again for organizing this and for everybody for joining.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing today. Just our last announcement. I am going to post this in the chat, but our next webinar is coming up next month. It's on Wednesday, February 9th, 1 p.m. Eastern. It is the 4th session of our Doctrine and Discovery webinar series called Centering and Other, Elevating White Normativity, Suppressing Racial and Indigenous Identities, how the Doctrine of Discovery does that, what that looks like today. It'll be a very, very robust conversation, and I hope you are able to join us and that you are able to invite some friends as well. This recording will be shared as well. You can find this recording and all of our past recordings on our YouTube page. So just search Methodist Federation for Social Action on YouTube. Thanks again, everyone, for being here.